Good morning, everybody. Oh, come on. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to see you all. Before we go ahead and get started, there are plenty of seats right here up near me. All right. A couple quick announcements before we go ahead and get started. Please stay afterwards. We're going to have a Q&A session here. And Chief Moon is going to also be later going to be in the exhibit hall as well. But please make sure you stay here so we can do the raffle for the free admission. What would I call it? The free entry to next year's conference. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So without further ado, welcome.
Doesn't do anything. No, they didn't. No, I just got that. Stand by.
The anticipation is getting me.
The whole point, building it up.
Not that tall. Good day, everybody. It is both an honor and a privilege to introduce to you a trailblazer whose legacy has absolutely transformed emergency medical services as we know them today, Chief John Moon. John Moon began his EMS career in 1972 with Freedom House Ambulance after seeing the impressive crews in action while he was working as an orderly in a local hospital. After completing the necessary training on his own, he was hired by Freedom House and changed the course of his life, and many others. Mr. Moon demonstrated his competence and determination at his newfound calling and was selected by Dr. Peter Safar to be the first medic to perform endotracheal intubation on patients in surgery. After succeeding on his first attempt in the operating room, Moon went on to perform what is believed to be the nation's first intubation in the field by a paramedic. When the city of Pittsburgh ended its contract with Freedom House in 1975 and instituted its own ambulance service, Moon was one of the few Freedom House paramedics who successfully made and endured the transition. Despite their experience and demonstrated success, the Freedom House paramedics were required to undergo periodic written testing and ride as a third person on a crew with less experienced EMS clinicians during their transition to the newly formed city ambulance service. During his time at Pittsburgh EMS, Moon became a certified master scuba diver, the first and only African American in Pittsburgh public safety to acquire the certification. He progressed through the ranks and developed Pittsburgh EMS's first diversity recruitment program. One of Moon's hires was Chief Americ Gilchrist, who in 2023 became Pittsburgh's first African American EMS chief and the first woman in that role. John Moon retired as assistant chief of Pittsburgh EMS in 2009 after 34 years of service. Moon spent his early life in Atlanta, relocating to Pittsburgh during his high school years to live with family members following his parents' deaths. He continues to reside in Pittsburgh with his wife, with whom he shares 5 adult children. Moon now dedicates much of his time in retirement to enduring the history of Freedom House Ambulance is not forgotten. He travels the country speaking at Black History events and EMS conferences, as well as book signing tours with author Kevin Hazard, who I've been chasing him around and finally got mine signed today. With author Kevin Hazard, who featured Moon in his 2022 book, American Sirens. Most recently, he was an invited guest at President Biden's State of the Union address in 2024. It is my pleasure to introduce the pioneer in pre-hospital airway management and beyond, who has left a lasting legacy influencing emergency medical care, Mr. John Moon.
Good morning or good afternoon. Okay. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here this morning. And I can't thank each and every one of you enough for this opportunity, because you all are helping me fulfill the desires of my heart. And that's to make sure a part of a forgotten history of EMS, as we all take for granted today, the foundation rests in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But in order for you to actually understand the concept and the realization, I'm going to have to take you back in time. And we're going to take a trip back into the early 60s. And as I look around the room, very few of you were born during that time. So I'll try to bring you up to speed, but I'm going to take you back to 1967, and I'm going to take you to a somewhat neglected, underserved community. And it's a community where jobs were problematic, housing was problematic, and as a result of that, racism had reared its ugly head. And so all of this was creating a problem for this one underserved, neglected community. City government had turned its back on this community. The state government had turned its back on this community. So what I'm going to prove to you today is how a particular organization by the name of Freedom House Enterprise Incorporated, which was a nonprofit organization that was created in the Hill District to provide job training for the residents of this neglected, underserved community, as well as voter registration, job placement, and inside this organization was a mini food bank. And this organization actually delivered food to the residents of this underserved, neglected neighborhood. And while they were doing that, one of the members of the board of directors, his name was Phil Hallen, he came up with an idea. He said, if this community can deliver food to the residents of this neglected, underserved neighborhood, which I grew up in, why can't they deliver medical care? So, if you can imagine a community having to rely on the police to take you to the emergency room. The problem with that is kind of threefold. The community had what I would call an adversary relationship with the police. So they decided whether they wanted to come or not, how long it took them. They decided whether they wanted to transport you to the emergency room or not. So imagine, if you will, with me, a police van pulling up to your residence, two white officers getting out because there was no such thing as diversity, recruitment, or DEI at that time. And these gentlemen escorting you to the back of a police wagon that had perhaps dropped off a prisoner, an intox, placing you into the back of this vehicle on a canvas cot. And both officers getting up front and taking you to the emergency room. Now, if something happened to you back there, you stopped breathing or your heart stopped beating, there was no one back there to take care of you. So oftentimes you were worse off when you arrived at the emergency room than when they came to get you. So up comes this organization that says, we want to improve the medical care in our neighborhoods. We had residents that couldn't get to doctor's appointments. A cab wouldn't come to this community. So often transportation was a problem. So this gentleman came up with this idea, why can't we provide care to this community? But he didn't know how to get that done. So he reached out to the local hospital, Presbyterian University Hospital, which is now UPMC, and he was put in touch with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Peter Safar. Now, Dr. Safar was a visionary, and he was an innovator. And it was his idea that it wasn't how fast you got that person to the emergency room that made the outcome, but what was being done for them before they got there. But no one would believe him. He couldn't get that idea out to the world at all. So up comes this organization that wants to provide medical care for their community, and it was more or less a marriage. He agreed to train 25 men, and the requirement for this training program is you had to be black. And he agreed to that. So he took 25 of us African Americans and placed us in a training program, which was the most intense program that had ever been done anywhere in this country. We spent time in the emergency room actually treating patients, in the intensive care units treating patients, in the operating room treating patients. We actually spent time in the county morgue studying anatomy and physiology with the IV team. And we take all of this skill and we take it from the hospital out into the streets. It had never been done before. So you have in the Hill District community the most sophisticated pre-hospital care system anywhere in this country. And the interesting thing about that is the gentlemen that were on this vehicle, we were considered least likely to succeed, society's throwaways, unemployables. And as I think about those different labels, I think society made one mistake. They didn't tell us. So we went about living in the moment, providing a much needed service to an underserved community, and in turn created a foundation that we all take for granted today. EMS systems around the country, the foundation rests with Freedom House Ambulance Service. In addition to doing that, we also helped design the modern day ambulance. That oxygen unit that's on the side of the wall, the suction unit, the BP cuff that's there, we designed that. That seat at the head of the patient, that was our design. We raised the head of the vehicles because you couldn't perform CPR in a hearse-type vehicle. Because if any of you can remember the hearse type, the seat was off to the right, away from the patient. So we moved that seat to the head of the patient. We raised the head of the vehicle. We were the very first organization to transmit an EKG from the field back to the emergency room to allow the physician to see what we actually saw in the field. You are, in turn, looking and listening to the very first person in this country to do a tracheal intubation in the field. Now, that presented its own set of challenges. And as I reflect back on that, I can't help but think that I was called to the emergency room to meet with Dr. Safar. Didn't know why. And I donned the operating room attire, and we went to the operating room. And when that door opened, everything stopped. The room was as quiet then as this room is now. And everyone was looking at me. And once I found out why, is that the only time someone that looked like me came into an operating room was with a mop or a bucket. But I didn't have that. So I walked over to the patient's head, and Dr. Safar told the anesthesiologist, "Get up. You sit down and intubate that patient." I saw all of these people just like I'm looking at you all now. But once I performed that procedure, I didn't see any of you. And at that particular time, believe it or not, failure was not an option. Because had I failed that procedure, there's a great chance that paramedics would not be doing it today. In addition to that, we were in the process of writing the very first paramedics training manual that every paramedic in the United States was required to read in order to become a paramedic in this country. Emergency care in the streets. We actually had to prove, in order to put that in the book, that you could do those skills. So we take these skills, we take them out into the street, and we got a set of challenges that we hadn't anticipated. We had a community that was used to receiving care from the police. The swoop and scoop method, I would call it. They were so accustomed to the police coming up, grabbing them and rushing them off to the emergency room. So up comes Freedom House's paramedics, and we're taking blood pressures on the patient. We're taking EKG readings on the patient. We're administering different medications. We're performing CPR. In their mind, why are you messing around with my loved one? Why don't you just take them out of here and take them to the emergency room? So we had to train the community that whenever a Freedom House vehicle showed up at your door, this is what we're going to do. So in turn, we also had to train the emergency rooms because they were not accustomed to someone coming in there looking like me, talking to a physician or a nurse, giving them a past medical history, telling them what the vital signs were, telling them what the EKG reading was, administering a particular drug to them, hanging an IV bag. And while I'm on that point, I have one question to ask you. We're in an opioid crisis right now. And the drug of choice to treat that is what? Narcan. Narcan is this wonder drug. Everybody has it. You can buy it over the counter. I saw a display out in the hallway talking about Narcan and the effects of it and things like that. Addicts themselves carry Narcan, first responders, paramedics. But what people don't realize is we gave Narcan back in 1973. We were the very first to take it out of the emergency room or the operating room because it was used to reverse anesthesia, out into the field to treat heroin overdoses. There was no such thing as fentanyl at that particular time. So a lot of the things that paramedics do today, we had to basically set the foundation for it. So you have Freedom House Ambulance Service operating in a particular neighborhood for roughly about 8 years. And during that time frame, despite the lives that we saved and the changes that we did, we still had to deal with constant hurdles. Hurdles of racism, where patients wouldn't allow us to touch them or place a BP cuff on their arm because of who we were. So we had to design a way to get around that. In addition to that, we noticed that the police department, there was no 911 system then, were not giving us the calls in our respective neighborhoods. So we had to devise a way around that. So we bought a police scanner, and we start monitoring police calls. And we, in turn, self-dispatched. And oftentimes, we would arrive at the patient's home, treat them, and transport them to the emergency room and pass the police en route to the location. In addition to that, we had a contract with the city of Pittsburgh to provide emergency care in the downtown business district. So what we hadn't noticed during that time frame is the political winds were starting to change. People in your most affluent neighborhoods throughout the city started complaining to the mayor, how dare you let that rundown neighborhood welfare recipient patients have better medical care than I do. I voted for you. I contributed to your campaign. I own this $1 million business. So he subsequently had to do something. He couldn't just get rid of Freedom House. So he and his cabinet devised a very particular scheme. What he started out doing is he issued a directive to Freedom House that you cannot use your sirens en route to emergency calls because they're making too much noise. So in turn, we had to drive and stop at the red light and wait for it to change, and then go to the next red light and wait for that to change, which impacted our response times. In doing that, we also had a contract with Pittsburgh to provide service to this business district. And every year, we expected to receive a check from the city for roughly about $50,000, which was a lot of money at that time. So the mayor, in turn, decided, well, maybe I'll give him $5,000 in January. Maybe March, I'll give him another $5,000. In April, I'll give him 10. So that lack of funding impacted our payroll. It impacted our operations. All this was being done to eliminate this particular service. And unbeknownst to us at that time, behind the scenes, he had decided to start his own EMS system. And there was no room in it for an entity such as Freedom House. So he starts his own EMS system and brought an all-white organization into the city of Pittsburgh. And in doing that, the individuals brought with them preconceived ideas as to what it would be like coming into an urban environment. It's the most dangerous place in the world. I have to prepare myself. So they came in with knives and guns in their vehicles. Unfortunately, we were dressed like the police, so there were handcuffs on the ambulances. The vehicles also were equipped with what I would call 7-cell flashlights, which are about this long, not to find your way around in the dark, but to use as a weapon because you never know what could happen to you in this urban environment. We were dressed like the police, so it was nothing for an EMS unit to put its red lights and sirens on to pull over a car that ran a red light. Because in my mind, I have this authoritarian type of mentality. In addition to that, this particular service, Pittsburgh EMS as it is today, the paramedics were trained to think that people in public housing complexes, the low-income neighborhoods, don't have heart attacks. They don't have strokes. There's no diabetes in those areas. The only thing you're going to get is domestic violence and drug overdoses and shootings. If you want a heart attack or a stroke, it only happens in an affluent neighborhood. So that culture continued on from the very beginning. Now, I'm going to tell you the role that Freedom House played in it. Freedom House itself was not supposed to be a part of Pittsburgh EMS's system. So as I'm looking around the room and I'm looking at the majority of you, very few of you have heard of Freedom House. And even though that saddens me, I know the reason why. We entered into an agreement with the city of Pittsburgh that once you consumed our service, you would take the personnel, you would take the equipment, we would not have to undergo any additional training, and it would be a smooth transition. Written agreement. But there was one thing missing in that agreement. It said I had to take you, but it didn't say I had to keep you. So at that particular time, and we're going back to the 1975, Pittsburgh EMS instituted a systematic elimination process where we were systematically eliminated through trial and error, through stressful situations. Despite the fact that I had all this experience and all this knowledge, I wasn't allowed to do anything. I couldn't drive the vehicle, I couldn't talk on the radio, I couldn't examine patients, all in an attempt to frustrate me to say, okay, y'all got this. I don't need to deal with it anymore, I'm out of here. And the goal was, if you get rid of the history makers, you essentially get rid of that part of history that they made. So I understand why not too many of you have heard of Freedom House Ambulance Service, because the department made sure that that was not going to happen. So that makes me very passionate about bringing this part of history back into the forefront that has been dormant for well over 50 plus years. So I go to Pittsburgh EMS, and I was never a part of the crew. I was always the person that came over from Freedom House. As fate would have it, I went on a call with the crew that I was the third person observing with. And we walked to a patient's home, and the patient was unconscious, not breathing, and didn't have a heartbeat. And the crew that I was working with didn't know what to do. They panicked. So they looked at the person that wasn't allowed to do anything and say, you take over. So once I assign duties and responsibilities, you start the IV, you put the person on the monitor and stuff. And I intubated the patient, and we saved the individual's life, and that was fantastic. But it all had to be kept quiet because I wasn't allowed to do anything. During that time, I had to make a decision. Do I remain this steadily unnoticed, quiet, reserved individual? Or do I step up my game and become more assertive, become more vocal? And I chose the latter. I wanted Pittsburgh EMS to know who John Moon was. So I became more vocal on calls and more outspoken on different situations and things, to the point where I got noticed. And I started getting promotions. But then I noticed that the department remained steadily white. So I became a troublemaker. I challenged the department on its hiring process. Pittsburgh EMS at that time went 10 years without hiring an African American. So I challenged the department on that. And needless to say, not that it wasn't met with resistance, because it was. I designed the very first diversity recruitment program in the history of the department. And I used the same format that Freedom House did when it recruited its individuals. People in the community that had no idea what an EMT was or what a paramedic was, and placed them into a training program and gave them a salary and trained them. And once they completed it, I was able to get Pittsburgh EMS to hire these individuals while they were there. And that became the normal way that Pittsburgh EMS hired until I left. And once I left, unfortunately, it went back to the normal way of doing things. And right now, the diversity issues are somewhat dismal. And one thing that I like to introduce to any EMS systems is you have to invest in your community. That's where your allies are. So it's no longer a us versus them type of mentality. Because if you want to accomplish your diversity efforts or your employment shortages and things, you just go out into the community and recruit from there. And as I did that, the department steadily started to change. The diversity issues started to come into focus. We started representing the community in which we served. So I remained with Pittsburgh EMS for roughly 34 years. And what I didn't know at that time is I was sabotaging my own career. And I spent time trying to get people to look like me into the department that I hadn't noticed that the department had designed a way to eliminate me from moving up the ranks. And as a result of that, I subsequently got passed over for a promotion by a gentleman who I had been his boss for 15 years. And I had to report to him. So after spending 34 years with Pittsburgh EMS, I had to make a decision. Do I stay there and show you how tough I am, or do I cut my losses and leave? And I chose to do the latter. And in doing that, I often have a tendency to reflect back on this group of what I would call creative change makers. And I think about the disappointments and the setbacks and the broken promises that we all had to endure during that time frame. And then I look down here on the front row to my right with this young lady that's sitting in this white shirt over here. And then I can smile and say it was all worth it. All of the disappointments and broken promises that we endured, that's the end result of it. That's the very first African-American chief of Pittsburgh Emergency Medical Services in the 50-year history of the department. Ironically, she's someone that I hired 25 years ago during my diversity recruitment program. So I essentially passed the mantle on to her. Would you stand up, Chief Gilchrist? She's near and dear to my heart. And even though I'm no longer with Pittsburgh EMS, and I love that department, and I love the people that work there, and it will always have a special place in my heart, I can't help but think that every time I think about her and all the trials that we've gone through, it was a joy to pass the mantle on to someone that's near and dear to my heart. You all have heard the history of a forgotten service. You all know about the trials and struggles and setbacks and disappointments that we as an organization went through. You now know that the foundation of EMS, every EMS system in this country, rests with Freedom House Ambulance Service. It didn't begin in Jacksonville. It didn't begin in Los Angeles. It didn't begin in Seattle or Miami. It began right in the city of Pittsburgh, in the Hill District, with a group of individuals that nobody thought would amount to anything. So that's my proudest accomplishment, and I implore each and every one of you, or I appeal to each and every one of you, to take this part of history back out to your fellow organizations and back out to your communities and things, because every EMS system in this country rests on the shoulders of Freedom House Ambulance Service. And out of that was born the very first paramedic manual, Emergency Care in the Streets. We essentially wrote that book. And unfortunately, as more and more editions are being put out, Freedom House has become a footnote in that manual. They talk about how great Miami's systems are in Jacksonville and Los Angeles and Seattle's, how those services started and what they accomplished. And then they talk about Freedom House, and they tell us that we were only a group of black men that didn't have an opportunity to get a high school education. But we wrote the book. So as I stand here before you this morning, those are the motivating factors that keep me going. Those are the things that I look forward to talking to the people about. Because if no one speaks about that history, it will be forever gone. And I have vowed not to ever let that happen. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. You guys. Please. The organization has been so gracious to allow me to open it up for a Q&A component. So I believe there will be someone walking around with mics that if you have a question, maybe it's something that I omitted, I'll be more than happy to address it. So the floor is open.
It's online, if you could repeat that.
Where did you get your initial funding for this project? Where did that all get started?
The initial funding came from different foundations, the Ford Foundation, Maurice Medical Falk Foundation, the Hillman Foundation. So basically, if you look at the makeup of Freedom House, we were kind of built on what I would call fiscal quicksand, because we were never really on solid footing because you had to depend on a grant here and a loan there and a donation here. But I oftentimes think about the perseverance of the people that worked there. We were determined, no matter what the cause was, to provide an essential service to this underserved community. And I hope you saw one of the vehicles that we had with two people sitting in the back. And if you look at that vehicle, you can see rust around the edges, and perhaps the tires are somewhat worn, and the hubcaps are missing. And probably you could say to yourself, I would never be caught riding in a vehicle that looked like that. But to me, that vehicle spells out perseverance, resiliency, and determination by a group of creative change makers that were caught in the moment, providing a service to an underserved community that we all take for granted today, where EMS systems are glorified on television. So it's not always what it looks like. You have to think about the trials and tribulations and struggles that people had to go through to get you to the point where you are today. Yes?
Lived through that time, I notice in your pictures that not only were you an African American male population, but there are plenty of women in those pictures too. Were you a trailblazer in that as well to help? Because that was unusual for women to be in roles of that kind of responsibility.
Absolutely. One of the things about that is we wouldn't be able to do it today, but the female personnel were dispatchers as opposed to being paramedics in the field. One of the drawbacks with that is once Pittsburgh EMS started its own system, there was no training for them. So we had one individual that came over from Freedom House, a female, who went on to get her EMT certification, became a paramedic for the city of Pittsburgh, went to nursing school and got a nursing license. So all she needed was an opportunity. And once she got that, she took it and ran with it.
Has the city of Pittsburgh ever publicly acknowledged the legacy of Freedom House and how they were treated?
February 1st of last year, during Black History Month, the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh acknowledged the wrongdoing that the city had done to the organization as well as to the employees and offered a heartfelt apology. The ironic thing about that, and just to let you know how things are ordained that we don't know about, is that despite the fact that I wanted to someday be chief of Pittsburgh EMS, that was never going to happen. My job was to break down barriers and hurdles and things that for people to come after me to get in there. That's a prime example right there. Unfortunately, during that time frame, the mayor himself, Pittsburgh elected his first African-American mayor, 2 years ago? 2 years ago. He was 3 years ago. The mayor was someone that I worked with during the diversity recruitment program when I was with the city of Pittsburgh. So the mayor comes in, and knowing the trials and struggles that I went through at Pittsburgh EMS, ironically, that's the result sitting right there. So he appointed the very first African-American chief of Pittsburgh EMS in the 50-year history of the department. So we were not able to compete in that political environment back then, but as the winds of change started to occur, changes started to happen.
Good
Yes.
morning. Hi, I'm with the William G. Vogel EMS training program over at Jersey Shore Medical Center. 2018, we revamped our program so that we added supplementary material. We turn out about 100 to 120 EMTs every year, and the very first thing they learn in their operations section is a history of Freedom House, because it's that important. Thank you for all you've done.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm also a fellow diver. I was wondering, did you become a dive master to also enhance on your EMS skills and everything for the city of Pittsburgh? And what were your trials and everything to become that in that day and age?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because let me take you back for a minute and I'll give you the answer to that. When I first applied to work for Freedom House, I walked into their offices and said, I'm here to apply for a job. And the gentleman said, okay, if I showed you a picture of the heart, would you be able to diagram the circulatory system? No. Okay, if I showed you a picture of the lungs, would you be able to diagram the respiratory system? No. He said, okay, you're not qualified to work here. So, unfortunately, at that time, it sounded bad, but what he did is he unleashed a series of what I would call motivating factors that I didn't know I had, to the point that no matter what trial or what struggle or what hurdle that I came up against, I was determined to overcome it. So the DIVE program itself was a way to prove to me that I couldn't do it, and subsequently ended up being a master scuba diver. And to this day, there's never been another African American in Pittsburgh to accomplish that goal.
Mr. Moon, I was nervous as shit when I performed my first intubation. How nervous were you performing the first intubation?
Well, one of the things, and I admitted to mention, we had a medical director by the name of Dr. Nancy Caroline, who was instrumental in writing the book. When she first came to Freedom House, we didn't trust her. And the reason we didn't trust her is because we were so accustomed to white physicians coming in and padding their resume and moving on to bigger and better things. So when she came in, here's this other person coming in to pad her resume and move on. So she had to earn our trust. And in doing that, she spent a lot of time with us. She would ride on the vehicles. She would wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and challenge us on the treatments that we were doing on patients and things of that nature. So once she earned our trust, then we had to prove to her that we were good as we thought we were. She went on to prove to us that we were better than what we thought we were. And she did that by challenging us on different procedures. And the best example I could give you, imagine a 5'2" Jewish woman walking down the halls of a hospital with 4 black males with afros and beards. Walking right into an intensive care unit, not stopping at the desk saying we're here or what have you, but walking right up to the patient's bedside, challenging us on what medication is this patient on, what's the diagnosis, listen to the lung sounds, what's the EKG reading. So she was able to prove to us that she cared, number one, and we ended up, it was a love relationship. So nervous about an intubation was the last thing on my mind. I often think that when she told me to do it, I thought she had lost her mind because it was less than a week after I did it in the operating room. So, but she had that level of confidence in us that we didn't have in ourselves. So as far as fear, she proved to us that was nothing out there that could happen to a patient that we couldn't handle. The outcome wasn't always going to be positive, but it wasn't because we couldn't deal with that situation. So nervousness was the least of my worries at that time.
Mr. Moon, good morning. I often talk about how there's no greater honor, no greater privilege than being able to serve the community that you grew up in. I assume that before you were walking down that street and walked into that office to talk about the heart and talk about the lungs, that there was a catalyst that sparked inside of you that said, this is something that I want to commit my life to, or at least something that I want to attempt. What was that catalyst, that one thing that really made this be something that you wanted to at least attempt or commit your life to?
Well, during the introduction, it was mentioned that I was an orderly in a hospital, and I was content there. You change bedpans and you bathe patients. You take them back and forth to different specialty units and things like that. You lift the heavy ones. You put in Foley catheters in the male patients and things. And I was content until two of Freedom House's paramedics came in and they commanded the attention of that room. They didn't have to say anything. Just their mere presence garnered the utmost respect of everybody in the room that they were in. They were taking a patient that was being discharged. And it was something about these two guys that kind of initiated that part of excitement into me to the point that, okay, that's what I wanted to do. But I didn't know how to find out. Now, you two may realize it. I went to the yellow pages of the phone book and found out where their offices were located. And that's when I walked in. And so these two guys who I probably worked with and never knew their names, they were the ones that primarily ignited that passion that it was a calling on me that I never knew I had at that time. And I haven't looked back since.
Good morning, sir. Do you have any records of how many people Freedom House transport in the time of the years that you were in service? Thank you.
Say that again. You're talking to 75-year-old ears.
Do you have any records how many people do you transport for the years that you were in service with Freedom House?
Well, a great number of them did. One gentleman in particular didn't come with the city of Pittsburgh. He went to Cleveland, Ohio, and started their EMS system from the ground up. He also became public safety director for the state of Ohio and public safety director for the city of Columbus. He, in turn, was on Columbus's city council, and they named a fire station, which I hope was in my presentation, after him, Mitchell J. Brown Fire Station. So if you look at that, and I mentioned that we were labeled as the least likely to succeed, or society's throwaways, we took those labels and, proved society wrong. Because just because you say I'm something doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be it. So we all used whatever label we were given as a motivating factor. Some of us were somewhat stronger than the others, but are determined, I should say, than the majority of the other people. But it's a label that we were given. Unfortunately, it was unfair, but we use it as a motivator.
I have a question while I walk back there. How did the doctors train you in intubation?
Well, we spent time in dog labs under the cover of darkness. We would go to the lab and put dogs in cardiac arrest and intubate them. We would also overdose them with a narcotic and administer Narcan to them. We would put them in cardiac arrest and perform CPR on them, all in an attempt to try to get a feel of what it would be like once we got out into the field. So nowadays, obviously, you got the best of both worlds, but you got video intubation and stretchers that lift themselves and things like that. So I tried the video intubation once, and I had the camera, and for some reason, I kept veering off to the right, trying to. Yes.
Thank you for being here today. I had the opportunity to work with some contemporaries and colleagues of Nancy Caroline and Peter Safar and heard about Freedom House through them. You talked about some of the issues that happened in Pittsburgh from the city end. Tell me about what the culture was in the hospital when you were training.
Great question. I mentioned that we had to train the emergency rooms to receive the type of care that you all take for granted. You wouldn't dare come into a hospital without giving the ER staff a rundown on the patients, a past medical history and things like that. The very first time I did that, I was actually with Dr. Caroline. And we kind of rehearsed what I was going to tell the ER staff. We had a 25-year-old male that suffered a syncopal episode while lifting some boxes at work. His past medical history was a heart murmur. His lungs were clear. We started an IV on him. His EKG was a tachybrady rhythm. And here he is. And I ran that down to her, and she busted out laughing. And I was very, very offended by that. So I went back out and expressed my displeasure to Dr. Caroline, and she told me, she said, if you don't learn to speak the language of the emergency room, no one would ever listen to you. Go back in there and find a physician. So I went back in and found a physician, and basically it was received very well. Complicating that factor, remember when I did the very first intubation, I took the patient to the emergency room. I got challenged by the doctor. Who did this? I said, I did. And who are you? I'm John Moon. And who told you to do it? Dr. Nancy Caroline. And who are you working for? I said, Freedom House Ambulance Service. So it was a challenge to teach the emergency rooms that whenever we came in with the patient, expect pre-hospital care had already been done on that patient, because it was something that was unheard of at that time. We were so far ahead of just so far ahead, it just boggles my mind. I talked to you all about Narcan. None of the overdose patients that we had ever woke up in the back of our vehicles. And we planned it that way. You laugh, but I didn't want you to wake up so you would get mad that I ruined your $25 high, so you wanted to fight or jump out the vehicle or do whatever. So I kept you in a confused, dazed state until I got you to the emergency room, which is a more controlled environment. If your breathing stopped, big deal, I can control that. If it slowed down, I just give you, and what you, nowadays you just shoot the Narcan into the patient and they jump up and, run away. We titrated it in a bag of D5 and W. Just pushed 0.4 milligrams in there and started an IV on the patient and gradually gave it to them and monitored their respiratory rate. So we were so far ahead of our time that it just boggles my mind that we were doing things that were only designed for the emergency room or the operating room.
If there are more questions.
Thank you so much for being a trailblazer. Hopefully I can help give some positive feedback to you from this group. Several years after you, I became a paramedic, and guess what book I used? Emergency Care in the Streets. Can we have a show of hands how many people learned from that book? There you go.
Thank you so much. That's one of our crowning moments as far as working at the Freedom House.
If there are no other questions, I'm going to actually turn it over to our Deputy Commissioner to give some closing remarks.
Now, I don't know if they're going to be closing remarks. But what I did want to say is thank you for coming. Kelly Anderson, Deputy Commissioner, Department of Health, Public Health Services Branch, and I have the honor of having the Division of Disaster Preparedness, Resiliency, and Emergency Medical Services. Say that 5 times fast under my purview. But listening to you today, and this was not planned from the Department of Health, I just want to say thank you. Not only thank you for all that you've done, thank you for coming here today. Thank you for paving the way for others with your innovative thinking and dedication. Your groundbreaking work was and continues to be truly inspiring, and we are grateful for your vision and commitment to pushing boundaries. Please know that you continue to be a true inspiration to aspiring leaders like myself. Thank you for showing us what is possible with little determination. They can't tell us no. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I'm going to go somewhere and cry now, so. But thank you all for helping me fulfill the desires of my heart. I can't thank you all enough. Thank you so much.
Okay, before everybody leaves, Chief Moon, I think I can express this as from everybody else in this room. I'm glad that you didn't take the throwaway of society to heart, because you're not a throwaway, nor is anybody else in this room. We thank you for setting that foundation for all of us here today. So if anybody didn't want to speak in front of the group here, has questions later, Chief Moon will be in by the OEMS table, so you can ask some questions there during the exhibit hours. So thank you very much, sir, for everything that you have done for our profession. Yes. Additionally, the Freedom House Amira will be presenting some additional facts and information and education if you all want to join her in, I had it written down what room number it was. Wildwood 3-4 at 2:15. So I'm sure she would love to have you at her session this afternoon. And one final thing that we have, somebody wins a free conference for next year. Chief Moon, would you do the honor of selecting one of these cards for somebody who can win this conference? Please mix them up.
I want it to be fair. It says John Moon on it.
Drum roll, please. Wonderful. Okay, William Stockholm. William, are you here? Yes, you are, sir. Thank you very much, everybody. And